She called 911 on me for parking in my own driveway. She never expected to meet me again, wearing the judge's robe. It was supposed to be an ordinary Saturday. I had driven back from a late night at the courthouse, wearing jeans for once instead of a robe. My plan was simple: coffee, garden, peace. But as I backed into my driveway, a woman across the street, my new neighbor, stepped out, phone in hand, eyes narrowed. She didn't recognize me. Not yet. "Excuse me," she shouted. "You can't park there, that's private property." I calmly replied, "Ma'am, this is my driveway." She glared as if I had insulted her. "We have HOA rules, I'm calling the police." I smiled politely. "You do what you think is right." 5 minutes later, 2 patrol cars pulled up, lights flashing. It wasn't my first time being on the receiving end of law enforcement, but it was certainly the most absurd. The flashing blue and red lights sliced through the quiet evening, reflecting off my truck's chrome fender as the 2 patrol cars pulled up behind the driveway. The gravel crackled beneath their tires. I stood still beside the hood, arms crossed, waiting. I already knew who had called. It wasn't hard to guess. Karen, my next-door neighbor, stood at the edge of her property line, phone raised high like a trophy, shouting into the camera about lawbreakers and property violations. The officers stepped out cautiously, hands resting on their belts, eyes sweeping the scene. "Sir," the older one began, "we got a call about a possible trespassing issue." I didn't move right away. Instead, I reached into my jacket pocket slowly, deliberately, and pulled out 2 items: my ID and the thick manila envelope that contained my property deed. I handed both to the younger officer, who accepted them with practiced neutrality. The older one kept his gaze on Karen, who was still narrating the situation loudly to her phone like she was hosting a live reality show. The younger officer's eyes flicked between the papers, his brow furrowing slightly. Then he looked up at me again, this time with a flicker of recognition. "Wait," he muttered, lowering his voice. "Judge Michael Hayes." I nodded once quietly. His expression changed instantly, respect mingled with embarrassment. The older officer turned toward him, confused, until the younger one handed him the ID. He read the name and let out a quiet sigh. The tension drained from his stance almost immediately. "Judge Hayes," the older officer said carefully, "I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding." Karen's voice cut through the air before I could answer. "Misunderstanding? He's blocking community access. He thinks he owns the street." She jabbed her finger toward my truck, her camera still rolling. "I've been telling the HOA about his behavior for months. He thinks the rules don't apply to him." The officers exchanged a quick glance, one of those silent exchanges seasoned cops use when they realize they've just been dragged into something absurd. The younger one tried to reason with her. "Ma'am, this truck appears to be parked on private property." "Private property?" she scoffed, taking a few exaggerated steps forward. "That driveway is part of the HOA-maintained easement. I looked it up." I finally spoke then, my voice even and calm. "Actually, it's not." I gestured toward the edge of the gravel. "The easement ends exactly 3 feet from where my tires are. You can see the boundary marker right there." I pointed to the small iron stake embedded in the dirt, half buried but visible. The older officer crouched, brushing away a bit of soil, confirming the marker. "He's right," he said flatly. "This is clearly on his property." Karen's face twisted, her confidence faltering, but she doubled down. "That can't be right," the HOA said. I held up a hand. "The HOA doesn't determine property boundaries. County land surveyors do." Then, with the faintest smile, I added, "And I happen to have their signed verification if you'd like to see it." I reached into the envelope again and produced the official survey sheet, stamped and notarized, the county seal glinting faintly under the porch light. The younger officer took it, skimmed it quickly, and handed it back with a nod. "Everything checks out," he said. "You're well within your rights, Judge Hayes." Karen's phone wavered slightly in her hand. She stopped recording for the first time since the officers had arrived, her face pale with disbelief. "Wait, you're a judge?" she asked, the word catching awkwardly in her throat. I met her gaze and didn't bother to answer. The younger officer did that for me. "Yes, ma'am. Judge Hayes serves in the county court." Silence that followed was almost satisfying. The woman who had so confidently summoned the law to my doorstep now stood frozen, her authority evaporating in an instant. The officers shifted their tone completely, professional still, but careful now, respectful. "Sir," the older officer said, turning back to me, "we'll file this as a false report unless you'd prefer to handle it differently." I glanced at Karen, whose face had gone from red to white. She started stammering, "I didn't mean, it's just that he's been." I cut her off gently. "I think a warning will do for now." The younger officer nodded, jotting something in his notebook. "Understood." Karen sputtered, but he's been blocking." The older officer held up his hand, his patience thinning. "Ma'am, it looks like this gentleman is parked on his own property. If you have a complaint, you'll need to take it up with your HOA, not the police." Her lips parted, but no sound came out. For once, she had no script, no authority, no audience who believed her version of events. The officers turned back toward their vehicles, nodding politely to me as they went. As they drove off, the fading strobe of their lights flickered across the front of my house. The air felt lighter somehow. Karen lingered a few moments longer, glaring in silence before muttering something about unfair treatment and storming back across her yard. I stood there a while after she left, listening to the rhythmic chirp of crickets and the faint hum of the evening wind. The absurdity of it all almost made me laugh. She had called the police on a sitting judge for illegal parking. Behind the humor, there was something else brewing, a deeper realization. This wasn't about parking. It wasn't even about boundaries. It was about control. Karen wasn't just a nosy neighbor. She was a self-appointed enforcer for a homeowners association that had long forgotten its purpose. And if she was willing to weaponize the police to prove a point, there was no telling what came next. I turned back toward my porch, sliding the deed and survey back into the envelope. Under the porch light, the seal of the county court glinted like quiet armor. I knew this incident wasn't over. It was the first ripple before the storm. The moment the HOA realized that their usual tactics wouldn't work on me. And as the night deepened, I decided something. Next time they came for me, I wouldn't just defend my rights. I'd make them answer for every line they'd crossed. I didn't press charges or argue. I simply said, "Gentlemen, I appreciate your time." The two officers exchanged glances, clearly relieved they wouldn't have to deal with paperwork or an irate homeowner. They tipped their hats, muttered something about a misunderstanding, and returned to their cruiser. Karen, however, wasn't done. She stood on the edge of my driveway, arms crossed, phone still pointed at me. Her lips were thin with fury. "You think this is over, don't you?" she snapped. "You think just because you're some big shot you can block the road? You'll regret this, Judge Hayes. Everyone around here will know what kind of neighbor you really are." I didn't respond. I had learned long ago that silence was more unnerving than confrontation. Her words bounced off me like pebbles against stone. I turned, walked back up to my porch and closed the door behind me. Through the window, I could still see her packing, filming the patrol car as it drove off, shouting to no one in particular about abuse of power. For the next few days, she doubled down on her campaign. She sent angry emails to the homeowners association. Yes, the same HOA that technically didn't even govern my property, demanding disciplinary action against me. She left anonymous flyers in mailboxes, claiming I was using my position to intimidate locals. She even spray-painted a crude message on the edge of my split-rail fence one night. "No one is above the law, but I didn't bite." I fixed the fence quietly, replaced the boards, and kept to my routine. That's what always unnerved people like her. They needed a reaction. Without it, they spiraled. Then one gray morning, I was sitting in chambers reviewing pretrial motions when the clerk handed me a new case file. "This one just came in from county," she said. "Looks like a series of misdemeanor citations, vandalism, harassment, trespassing complaints, several tied to neighborhood disputes." I flipped through the paperwork lazily until I reached the name on page 5. Karen M. Douglas, For a moment, I thought it was coincidence. Then I read the attached incident reports, one from a gas station where she had screamed at an attendant, another from a neighbor whose car tires she had slashed over a parking dispute. Same patterns, same temper. My eyes lingered on the dates, all within the past month. The irony was exquisite. She had been so obsessed with painting me as the villain that she'd exposed herself to the law's cold, impartial hand. And now, that hand had landed squarely on my desk. I could have recused myself. That would have been the proper, expected move. But ethics are nuanced, and my jurisdiction covered preliminary hearings, not sentencing. I wasn't determining guilt, merely whether there was enough probable cause to proceed, so I read every line, every statement, carefully, impartially. Her history painted a clear picture: escalating aggression, a pattern of harassment, and a stunning lack of accountability. The same qualities I'd seen up close, now under oath, documented, time-stamped. By the time I signed the warrant confirmations, my hands were steady. It wasn't revenge, it was order. Still, that night, as I sat on my porch watching the sunset bleed into the horizon, a part of me wondered how it would unfold. Would she even connect the dots? Would she realize that the very system she'd tried to weaponize against me was now turning its gaze toward her? 2 weeks later, I got my answer. I was coming back from the courthouse when I noticed a sheriff's cruiser parked near her driveway. Karen was standing outside, arms flailing, shouting about mistaken identity as deputies calmly explained the process. One of them handed her a stack of papers. I couldn't hear the words, but I could see the fury drain from her face as she read the first page. Her voice faltered. Her phone, for once, wasn't in her hand. As I drove past, I gave a polite nod through the window. She froze, realization dawning like a storm cloud behind her eyes. For the first time since I'd met her, she didn't speak. That evening, she removed her no trespassing signs and stopped glaring every time I drove by. The street, once filled with her drama, grew quiet again. Birds returned to the fence posts. Children played outside without her yelling about noise violations. But peace is rarely permanent with people like Karen. A month later, a new complaint arrived at the county clerk's office. This time, she was claiming she'd been unfairly targeted, that someone in the system was out to get her. The irony would have been laughable if it weren't so tragic. Her file was thick with self-inflicted wounds, all consequences of her own arrogance. When her hearing date was set, the local paper picked it up. A small headline buried in the back pages: "Local HOA board member faces charges for harassment, property damage." I didn't smile. Not exactly. But I did feel something close to balance, that rare, satisfying click of justice locking neatly into place. That night I received a short, unsigned note in my mailbox. Just a torn piece of paper, scrawled with angry handwriting. "You'll regret this. I always come back." Signature. But I didn't need one. I folded the note once, placed it in a file, and slipped it into my desk drawer under correspondence, pending. People like Karen don't just vanish, they pause, they regroup. And when they return, it's usually louder, messier, and far more desperate. I leaned back in my chair, the hum of the ranch quiet around me, and whispered into the still air, "Then I'll be ready." Her file was thick, thicker than most I saw for first-time offenders. I set it on my desk and watched the papers fan slightly as the air from the ceiling vent hit them. Inside were incident reports, officer statements, neighbor affidavits, even a few printouts of social media posts that had been submitted as evidence. Each page told the same story, not of a misunderstood neighbor, but of a woman at war with the world. The first section was familiar territory, repeated HOA harassment reports. I recognized the pattern immediately. Karen wasn't just a nuisance. She was the self-appointed sheriff of suburbia. She filed complaints about lawn heights, fence paint colors, noise from kids, birthday parties, and even the unsightly placement of a neighbor's garden hose. She turned her HOA position into a weapon, wielding it against anyone who didn't fall in line. Then came the noise complaints. Pages and pages of them, some from residents, some from her own bored colleagues. It turned out that the enforcer of peace was herself the loudest presence in the neighborhood. She'd host late-night board meetings in her garage, blasting music and shouting through megaphones about community standards. One report described her standing in the middle of the cul-de-sac at 11:30 p.m., berating a neighbor's teenage son for parking too close to her mailbox. But the last section of the file was what truly caught my attention. It was recent, just a few weeks old. A misdemeanor charge, false reporting and obstruction of justice. The irony was staggering. The same woman who had called the police on me for parking in my own driveway was now accused of wasting emergency services on imaginary crimes. Apparently, she had reported a break-in at her property. When officers arrived, they found no sign of forced entry, just a raccoon rummaging through her garbage cans. Instead of admitting the mistake, she doubled down, accusing the responding officers of being in on it. Her exact words, as quoted in the officer's statement, made me exhale through my nose. "You're protecting the real criminals. Don't think I don't know what's going on around here." She then refused to provide identification, called 911 again from her porch, and told the dispatcher she was being harassed by corrupt cops. That single act had earned her a misdemeanor for false reporting and obstruction for refusing lawful commands. I leaned back in my chair, running a hand through my hair. The absurdity of it all wasn't lost on me. The woman who had tried to use the law as her cudgel now found herself beneath its weight, and by the cruel symmetry of fate, she had fallen under my court's jurisdiction. Still, the rules were clear. I couldn't oversee her case personally, not entirely. Conflict of interest. Judicial ethics existed for precisely these moments. So I did what any proper judge would do. I logged the case, flagged it for reassignment, and wrote a short note in the margin, "Refer to Judge Moore. Prior interactions noted." But as I stared at her file before closing it, something made me pause. Her history wasn't just a list of petty grievances. It was a slow unraveling, a psychological spiral that had stretched over years. The deeper I read, the more the tone of her complaints changed. Early reports were polite, almost measured. "I believe there's a misunderstanding." But as time went on, they grew venomous, erratic, laced with paranoia. Words like conspiracy, targeted, and watching me appeared again and again. It made me wonder if the Karen who called the cops on me wasn't entirely in control of herself anymore. Maybe she never had been. That evening, as I sat alone in my study at the ranch, I poured myself a glass of bourbon and opened the file again. Outside, the wind moved softly across the pastures, the horses quiet in the stables. It was peaceful, the kind of peace she could never stand. I found myself tracing the ink on the final report. One of the arresting officers, the younger one from that day she'd called 911 on me, had signed it. His brief note at the bottom caught my attention. Suspect appeared agitated, paranoid, and verbally aggressive. Claimed to have been set up by the judge. My name wasn't mentioned, but the implication was there, hanging in the white space like a ghost. I closed the file carefully, aligning its edges, and slid it into my desk drawer. It wasn't my place to judge her here, not outside the courtroom. But there was a strange, almost poetic balance to it all, the wheel of justice turning on its own axis, indifferent and precise. In court, I was a man of restraint. But alone, I allowed myself a rare moment of reflection. Every action she had taken, every complaint, every insult, every call had been an attempt to assert control in a world that didn't bend for her. And now, she stood crushed beneath the very structure she once tried to manipulate. A knock at the door startled me slightly. It was Deputy Wilson, the same officer who had visited my property that day. "Evening, Judge," he said politely. "Sorry to bother you. Just came by to let you know Ms. Douglas's arraignment's scheduled for next Thursday. Thought you'd want to know since you were listed as a potential witness for her prior false report." I thanked him, nodded, and watched him leave. His cruiser's headlights disappeared into the darkness of the rural road. As silence returned, I sat in the dim glow of my desk lamp, the file still warm under my hand. Something told me Karen wouldn't go quietly. People like her never did. They saw justice as persecution, consequences as conspiracies. And when cornered, they didn't reflect, they retaliated. I exhaled slowly, feeling that old instinct return, the one that had served me through years of complex trials and dangerous defendants. The ability to stay calm, collected, and 3 steps ahead. Fate might have brought her into my courtroom, but it had also given me time. Time to understand her pattern. Time to prepare for whatever came next. As I closed the file for good that night, I said softly to no one in particular, "The law isn't revenge, Karen. It's balance. And balance always finds its way back." Then I turned off the lamp, letting the room fall into darkness, except for the faint outline of the thick folder on my desk, waiting, like a shadow that hadn't yet finished its story. The courtroom buzzed softly as I took the bench, the murmur of voices echoing off the polished oak walls. Mornings like this always carried a certain rhythm, the shuffle of papers, the low hum of conversation, the steady clack of the court reporter's keyboard preparing for another day of testimony. But today felt different. There was a subtle tension in the air, an almost electric weight that made every sound sharper. I adjusted my glasses, reviewed the docket, and nodded for the bailiff to begin. "Next case," he announced, his voice steady and professional. "Case number 4275B, State versus Karen Walker." Her name rippled through the courtroom like a quiet spark. I looked up as the doors opened at the back. Karen stepped in slowly, clutching her handbag with white-knuckled hands. Her usual bluster was gone. The woman who once shouted at officers and waved her phone in neighbors' faces now moved with hesitation. Her eyes darted nervously between the benches, scanning faces as if searching for an ally who wasn't there. Then her gaze found me. The moment was brief, but I saw the exact instant the realization hit her. Her expression froze, eyes widening as her breath caught in her throat. The color drained from her face. I met her gaze without reaction, calm, neutral, judicial. Years of experience had taught me to control every flicker of emotion, but inside I could feel the air between us tighten, a silent recognition of how far this had come. Her jaw trembled slightly. I could almost see her thoughts scrambling, trying to process the impossibility of it. The man she'd called the police on, the one she'd mocked, filmed, and tried to humiliate, now sat in the highest seat in the room, robe pressed, gavel in hand. The irony was lost on no one. I leaned forward slightly and spoke with even authority. "Ms. Walker," I said, my tone measured and clear, "please step forward." She hesitated, as though her legs might give out beneath her. The bailiff gestured gently, and she obeyed, her heels clicking softly against the floor. She stood before the bench, avoiding my eyes now, staring at the polished edge of the defendant's table instead. The clerk began reading the charges aloud: false reporting, obstruction of justice, and harassment under Municipal Code Section 12.3. Each count landed in the air like a weight. Karen's face twitched with each one. "Ms. Walker," I began, "you are here today for an arraignment hearing. This is not a trial. You'll be given an opportunity to enter a plea and to speak through your counsel." Her attorney, a young, eager public defender, rose beside her, visibly uncomfortable. He cleared his throat. "Your Honor, my client wishes to enter a plea of not guilty to all charges." "Duly noted," I said, writing it down without inflection. "Bail is set in accordance with the municipal guidelines. Pretrial motions are to be filed within 30 days. The lawyer nodded. Karen, however, seemed unable to move. Her gaze flickered up again, uncertain, almost pleading. "Why, Your Honor," she stammered, voice small now, I think there's been some kind of mistake." My tone remained professional. "If you believe there's a procedural error, your counsel may file the appropriate motion. Do you understand?" Her lips parted as if to protest, but no words came. She glanced around the courtroom, the audience benches filled with quiet observers, the court reporter typing without pause, the bailiff watching with impassive eyes. There was no sympathy here. Finally she nodded stiffly. "Yes, Your Honor. Very well," I said. "Then we will proceed according to the law." The rest of the hearing was routine scheduling dates, confirming discovery, setting parameters for witness lists. I handled it like any other case, each word deliberate, precise, untouched by personal feeling. Yet beneath the formalities I could feel the undercurrent of irony humming quietly. Every action she had taken to assert power, every petty complaint, every false call, it had all led her to this point. And now that power was gone, replaced by the cold structure of the justice system she'd once mocked. As proceedings wound down, her lawyer requested leniency in scheduling, citing emotional distress and recent public scrutiny. I granted it without hesitation. Fairness mattered, even when fate delivered poetic symmetry. When the bailiff called the next case, Karen lingered for a moment longer. She didn't move until her attorney gently tugged at her arm. As she turned to leave, she looked back one last time. This time, there was no anger in her eyes, only confusion, exhaustion, and a hint of something that might have been regret. I didn't meet her gaze again. I simply said, "Court is adjourned," and gave a single rap of the gavel. The sound echoed, final and steady. After the courtroom cleared, I stayed seated for a moment, staring at the empty defense table. The air still carried the faint perfume she'd worn, sharp, floral, the kind that lingered too long. I took a slow breath, gathering my papers. Justice wasn't about satisfaction. It wasn't about revenge or retribution. It was about alignment, restoring the balance between chaos and consequence. As I walked back to chambers, one of the clerks followed. "That was something," she said quietly. "You handled it well, sir." I gave a small nod. "The law handled it," I replied simply. Behind my desk, I opened the file again. The ink from the morning's proceedings was still fresh. My handwriting was steady, emotionless. But inside, I couldn't ignore the sense of closure beginning to settle, not triumph, just resolution. Out the window, the courthouse lawn stretched green and calm under the midday sun. Beyond it, I could almost see the faint line of the rural road that led back to my ranch, the same road where this entire conflict had begun. Sometimes, life doesn't need vengeance. It just needs patience. Karen had set the wheel in motion. The law had simply finished its turn. I closed the file gently, straightened my robe, and prepared for the next case. Another name, another story, another search for balance in a world too often ruled by chaos. But as I reached for my pen, I couldn't help but think, for Karen, this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of her reckoning. Her attorney stood at the defense table, palms flat against the wood, voice trembling with desperation. "Your Honor, my client's actions were never malicious. She genuinely believed she was in danger that night. It was a misunderstanding, an overreaction perhaps, but not a crime." The words echoed through the courtroom like a faint apology, hollow, unconvincing, and too late. Across from him, the prosecution sat calm and prepared. A neatly stacked pile of evidence sat on their table, transcripts, officer reports, and the most damning of all, digital copies of bodycam footage. The prosecutor rose slowly, a faint confidence in her tone. "Your Honor, with permission, the state would like to submit the footage as Exhibit A." I gave a curt nod. "Proceed." The lights dimmed slightly as the monitor flickered to life. The footage began with the shaky beam of a police flashlight cutting across a quiet suburban yard. The timestamp matched the night in question, the night Karen had called in a supposed break-in that turned out to be nothing more than a raccoon overturning trash bins. The video played and her voice filled the courtroom. It was shrill, sharp, and filled with the same venom I'd heard outside my driveway weeks before. "They are in on it," she screamed on the recording, pointing at the officers. "You're all protecting them, the neighbors, the judge, everyone. You think I don't know what's going on around here?" The camera turned toward her face, wild eyes, flushed cheeks, hands trembling as she gripped her phone. One of the officers, patient and professional, tried to calm her. "Ma'am, we've searched the property. There's no sign of forced entry. Please just come inside." Karen cut him off. "Don't tell me what to do. You're covering up a crime." In the corner of the footage, a raccoon scurried past the overturned garbage bins. It would have been almost comical if the moment hadn't been so tragic. The courtroom was silent, except for the audio, her own voice building into hysteria. She refused to show ID, refused to comply, called 911 again while officers were standing right there. Her tone was frantic, accusatory, paranoid. When the footage finally stopped, the silence that followed was suffocating. Even her own lawyer had gone pale. "Your Honor," he started weakly, "this doesn't reflect my client's usual behavior. She's been under significant stress." The prosecutor interrupted, tone cool and precise. "Stress does not excuse obstruction of justice, nor does it justify wasting emergency resources. Ms. Walker's pattern of behavior is clear: repeated false reports, harassment, and public disturbance. The evidence speaks for itself." I leaned back, hands folded on the bench. I didn't need to say much. The footage had already said everything that needed to be said. Karen sat rigid beside her attorney, face frozen, her earlier confidence shattered. She avoided looking at the screen. Her fingers twisted the hem of her sleeve nervously. For once, there was no outrage left in her. Only disbelief, the kind that comes when someone realizes their actions are finally being reflected back at them without distortion. "Ms. Walker," I said evenly, breaking the silence, "do you wish to make a statement?" She hesitated. Her lips parted as if to speak, but her voice faltered. I didn't mean for it to go this far," she murmured. They were watching me. People were watching my house, I thought." Her attorney placed a hand on her arm. "Ms. Walker," he whispered, trying to quiet her. But the words had already slipped into the record. I studied her face, the defiance gone, replaced by confusion and fatigue. Perhaps she truly believed her delusions. Perhaps her paranoia had grown roots long before I ever met her. But the law didn't deal in speculation. It dealt in evidence, and the evidence was unambiguous. "Ms. Walker," I said carefully, "the court acknowledges your statement. However, what we have here is a series of deliberate false reports, not a single act of confusion. These incidents consumed public resources and placed responding officers at unnecessary risk. This hearing is not about punishment, but accountability." She lowered her eyes. The courtroom was quiet enough to hear the hum of the overhead lights. The prosecutor stood again. "Your Honor, the state recommends probation with mandatory counseling and community service. Given the pattern of escalation, we also request a restraining order preventing Ms. Walker from filing further non-emergency complaints without verification." Her attorney objected weakly, citing her fragile mental state. But even he knew the battle was lost. The evidence was overwhelming, the bodycam footage irrefutable. As I reviewed the documents in front of me, I thought back to the first time I'd met her. The arrogance, the certainty that she could twist rules to her favor, the way she'd smiled when the police arrived to handle me. Now that same machinery she had tried to manipulate had turned its gaze back upon her. That was the truth she was finally forced to face, the truth she'd denied for years. Power doesn't shield you when you misuse it. I signed the order slowly, each stroke deliberate. When I was done, I looked up. "The court accepts the state's recommendations," I said. "Probation, counseling, and community service are hereby granted in lieu of jail time. Additionally, Ms. Walker is prohibited from filing non-emergency police reports without prior verification for 12 months. Karen's head dropped slightly, shoulders slumped. Her attorney nodded, whispering something she barely seemed to hear. The bailiff called the next case, but she didn't move. It took a gentle nudge from her lawyer before she finally stood. As she turned to leave, she looked back once more, her expression unreadable, part anger, part shame, part disbelief that her own voice had condemned her. When the door closed behind her, I sat in silence for a long moment. The courtroom slowly emptied. The clerk collected papers. The reporter paused her typing. The faint murmur of voices faded down the hall. I stared at the blank monitor, now black again, reflecting my own face faintly in its surface. The irony of it all lingered, not sweet, not satisfying, just balanced. Justice had spoken, not loudly, not cruelly, but clearly. She had cried wolf too many times, and when the truth finally arrived, there was no one left to listen. The courtroom felt unusually still that morning. The air held the weight of consequence, of endings long overdue. Karen sat at the defense table, her once-proud shoulders hunched, her carefully styled hair slightly disheveled. Weeks of testimony had stripped away her veneer of control. Gone was the woman who once barked orders at neighbors and called the police with performative outrage. Now she was just another defendant awaiting judgment. Her lawyer shifted uncomfortably beside her, a stack of disorganized notes in front of him. Across the aisle, the prosecuting attorney stood poised and unflappable, her closing statement still echoing faintly in the courtroom. The defendant's actions weren't a mistake, they were a pattern, an abuse of authority, of trust, and of the very community she claimed to protect. I reviewed my notes one final time, flipping through the thick file that had once been just a few pages but had grown into a chronicle of deceit, arrogance, and self-destruction. The evidence was overwhelming: bodycam footage, recorded HOA meetings, witness statements from half the neighborhood. It was all there. The fabricated violations, the false reports, the harassment of residents who had dared to question her petty dominion. When I finally looked up, the room seemed to quiet further, as though even the fluorescent lights held their breath. "Ms. Walker," I began, my tone steady, judicial. "This court has carefully reviewed all evidence presented in your case. The record reflects repeated misuse of emergency services, falsified claims against your neighbors, and actions that demonstrate a clear intent to harass and intimidate." Her eyes darted between me and her attorney. "I didn't mean to," she started, her voice trembling. I raised a hand, stopping her gently but firmly. "You had every opportunity to clarify your intent during testimony. You chose, instead, to deny what was plainly visible in the footage. You not only inconvenienced law enforcement, but you endangered the credibility of legitimate emergency calls. That cannot be dismissed as an accident." A murmur rippled through the gallery, quiet, restrained, but unmistakable. Many of those seated had been her neighbors, some victims of her behavior. A few leaned forward, as if to witness the moment justice finally exhaled. I continued, "You called the police under false pretenses not once but several times. You filed unsubstantiated HOA citations, imposed unlawful fines, and created a hostile environment for those who simply wanted peace in their own homes. The evidence shows a pattern of reckless disregard for truth and community welfare." Her lawyer stood briefly. "Your Honor, my client has expressed remorse," I interrupted softly, "not out of anger but necessity. Remorse is shown through action, not words rehearsed before sentencing." I paused then, studying her expression. There was something flickering beneath the surface, not defiance anymore but confusion, as though she couldn't quite understand how her small acts of control had spiraled into something she couldn't escape. It wasn't malice alone that had destroyed her, it was entitlement. I leaned slightly forward, my voice calm but resolute. "Ms. Walker, this court finds your actions reckless and in bad faith. You wasted emergency resources and harassed an innocent homeowner. You have eroded the very trust a neighborhood needs to function." Her lips parted, but no words came out. The verdict hung between us like a drawn curtain finally lifted. "Your sentence," I said, "is as follows. A fine of $5,000 payable to the county, 200 hours of community service to be completed within 12 months, and a written apology to each resident you falsely accused, including myself." The courtroom was silent, save for the soft scratching of the court reporter's pen. Karen's face went pale. She blinked rapidly, her throat tightening as the weight of humiliation settled in. Her lawyer leaned close, whispering something that sounded like a plea to maintain composure. But the mask had already cracked. She clasped her trembling hands together, nodding mechanically, her gaze fixed on the floor. I concluded, "Additionally, the court recommends that the Homeowners Association review its leadership practices and implement transparency measures to prevent similar misconduct in the future. No one individual should hold power without accountability." The gavel came down with a measured thud. "Court is adjourned." For a moment she didn't move. The bailiff gestured subtly and she finally rose unsteady. As she turned to leave, her eyes met mine one last time. Gone was the arrogance, the entitlement, the false confidence. In its place was something almost human, a fragile recognition of the damage she'd done, not just to others but to herself. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, perhaps realizing that nothing she could say would undo what had already been set in motion. As the courtroom emptied, I sat quietly at the bench, allowing the silence to return. Justice wasn't about revenge. It was about restoration, restoring order where chaos had thrived, truth where lies had festered. Outside, I saw through the tall windows as Corinne walked down the courthouse steps alone, the afternoon sun harsh on her pale face. She paused briefly, pulling her phone from her bag, the same phone she had once used to record and provoke. For a fleeting second, I wondered if she was tempted to film again, to narrate her version of events. But instead, she put it away and kept walking, swallowed by the noise of the city. In that moment, I felt no triumph, no gloating satisfaction, only a quiet certainty that the cycle had finally broken. For once, she wasn't the one calling for attention. And for the first time in a long while, the street outside my home, the very one she had turned into a battleground, would remain silent. And silence, I thought, was its own kind of justice. It was a quiet morning, the kind that carried a hint of closure in the air. The last traces of the courtroom storm had long since passed, and life had begun to settle back into its familiar rhythm. The leaves outside my porch had started to turn gold, dancing gently with the wind that swept across the driveway, the same driveway where everything had begun. I hadn't thought about Corinne much since the verdict, not out of cruelty or avoidance, but because the entire ordeal had become something I preferred to leave behind. The law had done its job, the truth had spoken for itself, and the neighborhood had returned to a long-lost calm. The HOA, once a weapon in her hands, had grown noticeably quieter. Board meetings became shorter, rules were enforced fairly, and for the first time in years, people greeted one another without suspicion. Then one crisp morning, I noticed an envelope in my mailbox. It wasn't the usual stack of bills or county correspondence. This one stood out, plain white, no return address, my name written in a shaky, almost hesitant hand. I turned it over once before opening it, sensing what it was before even reading. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper. The ink was slightly smudged, as if the writer's hand had trembled or a tear had touched the page. "I'm sorry for what I did. I didn't know who you were. I just assumed. I thought I was protecting my community, but I was really protecting my pride. I see that now." Wasn't long, barely half a page, but the words carried a weight no long apology could. It was the first time she'd taken responsibility without an audience, without a camera, without the safety of outrage. I stood there on the porch, reading the note again and again. I thought about the woman who had once stormed through HOA meetings, waving citations like a badge of power. The one who called the police just to prove she could. I thought of how easily assumption had turned into accusation, and how that single choice had set off a chain reaction neither of us could have predicted. "I didn't know who you were." Those words echoed louder than the rest. Not because they referred to my position or title, but because they revealed the deeper truth. She had never cared to know anyone beyond her assumptions. To her, neighbors weren't people. They were obstacles or pawns in her small game of control. I folded the letter carefully, then set it on my kitchen table. The morning sun filtered through the blinds, falling across the page like a quiet spotlight. I could almost hear her voice, but softer this time, stripped of arrogance and bitterness. I poured myself a cup of coffee and walked to the window overlooking my property. The same fence she'd once accused me of illegally extending now stood unchanged, sturdy and quiet. My truck sat in the driveway, the scene of her infamous trespassing report. It all seemed so distant now, like a story someone else had lived. Part of me wondered if her apology was genuine or if it was just another attempt to close a chapter neatly. But then again, sincerity isn't always about perfection, it's about effort. For someone like Corinne, even putting pen to paper meant something monumental. Later that day, I placed the envelope in my desk drawer, beside old photographs and commendation letters from years of service. Not because it belonged with them, but because it reminded me of something fundamental. Even those who fall hardest can sometimes find the courage to reach for redemption. Over the following weeks, word of her apology spread quietly through the neighborhood. I didn't share the letter itself, but people noticed her change. She started attending HOA meetings as a participant, not a tyrant. She spoke less, listened more. She even joined a local cleanup drive, though she stayed mostly on the edges, perhaps still learning what humility felt like. One Saturday, as I was unloading groceries from my truck, I saw her across the street. She hesitated before giving a small nod, a silent acknowledgement. Not a smile, not a wave, just a gesture that said, "I understand now." I returned the nod. That was enough. Sometimes justice doesn't roar. It doesn't humiliate or destroy. Sometimes it's quiet, a handwritten apology, a bowed head, a simple moment of self-awareness. I'd seen all forms of justice in my career, vengeful, delayed, imperfect. But this was different. This was human. In the evenings, I often sat on the porch with a book, the sound of cicadas replacing the chaos that had once filled the air. The neighborhood kids played freely again, their laughter echoing off the wooden fences. For the first time in months, the air felt clean, not because of any legal victory, but because peace had finally returned. Occasionally, I'd glance toward Corinne's house. The once busy driveway was empty most days, no longer crowded with HOA members and cars. She planted a small garden out front, bright marigolds and lavender, simple and unassuming. It was almost symbolic, a quiet effort to grow something in the soil she, once poisoned with conflict. And perhaps that was enough. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I opened her letter one last time. My eyes lingered on the final line. I just assumed. I set it down and whispered to myself, that's the problem. Because assumption is where most battles begin, and understanding is where they end. I turned off the porch light and let the night take over. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called out, the sound long and calm. For the first time in a long time, there was no tension in that sound, no edge of vigilance. Just peace. Justice, I realized, doesn't always demand noise or spectacle. Sometimes it's just a letter in a mailbox, an unspoken acknowledgement, and a heart finally at rest. Months had passed since the courtroom drama, and life in the neighborhood had returned to a fragile, comfortable rhythm. Corinne's house, once a constant source of tension, had grown quiet. The aggressive shouting, the daily harassment, and the unnecessary 911 calls all had ceased. It was almost eerie at first, walking past her property and hearing nothing. No tires screeching, no blaring music, no furious demands to enforce some imaginary rule. Just the soft hum of the wind through the trees, birds calling, and the occasional laughter of children playing in their yards. When I first moved through these streets after the verdict, there was still a residual tension, a collective holding of breath from neighbors who had been victims of her overzealous policing. But with each passing week, the quiet seemed to knit the community back together. People smiled at each other on the street again. Lawn chairs reappeared on porches. Hedges and fences, once inspected for infractions, were now just part of the scenery, no longer weapons in someone's self-appointed crusade. I began noticing small gestures from Corinne that hadn't been there before. A polite nod when our paths crossed, a brief good morning from across the street. At first I was wary, skeptical of the sudden civility. Old habits die slowly after all. But her gestures remained consistent, modest, almost hesitant, yet undeniably intentional. She wasn't trying to assert control anymore. She was acknowledging the presence of others, a small but important act of humility. It struck me then how often people confuse justice with power. They believe it lies in dominance, in proving someone wrong, in the loudness of consequence. Yet true justice, I realized, is much quieter. It's measured. It doesn't demand applause. It doesn't need theatrics or revenge. True justice is about restraint. It's about allowing truth to unfold naturally in its own time and trusting that consequences will find those who deserve them. I remembered the moments in the courtroom, the bodycam footage, the meticulous review of evidence, and her eventual apology. Those moments were lessons not just for her, but for everyone who observed them, the officers, the neighbors, the community, and even me. Justice didn't need to yell. It didn't need to humiliate. It only needed clarity, patience, and the unwavering application of the law. I parked in my driveway one afternoon, the warm sun spilling across the gravel and the soft clinking of the horses in the pasture. The driveway had been the epicenter of our conflict, the place where assumptions, arrogance, and small-minded vendettas collided. Now it was just a driveway. Mine. Neutral. Ordinary. I stepped out of my vehicle and took a moment to survey my property. The barn stood tall, the fences intact, the horses grazing peacefully. For the first time in months, there was no tension in the air. Only life, calm and unhurried. From the corner of my eye, I saw Corinne across the street. She was tending to her small garden, hands gently brushing the soil around the lavender and marigolds she had planted months ago. She paused, looked up, and gave a soft wave. I returned it, not with pride or triumph, but with acknowledgement. It was enough. There was no need for words, no need for confrontation. The gesture said everything necessary: recognition of mistakes, acceptance of consequences, and a willingness to move forward. It occurred to me then how many conflicts in life could be resolved if only restraint and patience were practiced. Too often, people rush to assert themselves, to dominate, to win. But true victory comes not from force but from understanding, from letting evidence, truth, and time carry the message. Corinne's story had unfolded in exactly this way. The system she had once weaponized against others had quietly, methodically, and fairly held her accountable. She had faced the truth, not through spectacle or humiliation, but through natural consequence and clarity of law. I walked to the porch, sitting in the warm afternoon light, sipping a cup of coffee. The streets were calm, the neighborhood restored. In that moment, I felt a profound sense of closure, not from revenge, not from punishment, but from balance restored. The lesson extended beyond Corinne, beyond her apology, beyond the fine and community service. It was a lesson about life itself. Justice is often silent, patience is powerful, and truth has a way of revealing itself when allowed the time to do so. Later, as I watched the sun dip behind the rolling hills surrounding my property, I thought about how easily people forget this principle. They think the gavel, the loud pronouncement, the spectacle, defines justice. But more often, the quiet moments, the handwritten letters, the small gestures of acknowledgement, the peaceful resolutions, carry more weight than any sentence could. I glanced back toward Corinne's property one last time. She was still bent over her garden, the sun glinting on her hair, absorbed in her work. No defiance, no hostility, just a woman tending to her life. And in that simple act, there was a kind of reconciliation more profound than any courtroom ruling could offer. I returned to my porch, settled into the chair, and let the cool breeze wash over me. The horses shifted in the pasture, the trees swayed gently, and the neighborhood carried on in a quiet harmony. The gavel, I realized, doesn't always need to strike. Sometimes silence is the loudest sentence of all. And as I watched the last slivers of sunlight fade from the horizon, I understood something fundamental. Justice, patience, and truth, when applied with restraint, leave a mark far more enduring than anger, confrontation, or noise ever could. Life, like the neighborhood, moves on, and those who learn the lesson truly do so quietly, but forever.